good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. We're really happy you're here to talk about this really critical subject, Innovation Roundtable, and hear from some experts in this field. I am Dianne Dain. I lead the UN Reboot Accelerator, and I am thrilled to be able to be on the World Humanitarian Forum Advisory Board, working in the space of innovation. And today we have some amazing guests who will help us not only enlighten how we can transition better and build back better and leave no one behind at this critical intersection of innovation during this time when actually we are more on technology, more divided as humans, and we need to innovate much more than technology. It includes innovating trust. And so we will turn to our experts. I'd like to first introduce this panel of experts and have them actually speak about their work. And first we will go to Mr. Ben Kumpf. He is the head of innovation at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development for the UK. Ben, over to you.
Thanks. Good afternoon from London, and pleasure to be on this panel. I work as Head of Innovation at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. And this is the merger of formerly the Department of International Development and the Foreign Office in the UK. So a lot of the work that I will be sharing and some of the thoughts are DFID legacy. And with that said, we do support the localization of humanitarian aid and humanitarian innovation as manifested in the Grand Bargain, by investments, for example, in the Grand Humanitarian Challenge, investments in the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, and we are having a panelist from ELRHA with us today who will talk later about that. I want to use the short amount of time that I have to not so much share some of the concrete investments that we do. For example, I'm happy later to lay out how we, for example, worked with the Met Office, with NASA and other partners to develop a predictive analytics tool to forecast the outbreak of cholera in Yemen, which led to early warning interventions by UNICEF and other partners that helped save lives. But I'd rather want to reflect for the fellow panelists and for the audience on innovation at large, proposing we can think of innovation having three distinct functions. It can be to enhance the effectiveness of interventions, including through new technologies. And the example from Yemen that I just mentioned would be one. It can be, and let's take the example of Netflix that started out with a clear mission. I want to bring quality entertainment in people's houses, with not only thinking through how can we make this more effective by shipping out DVDs, making it faster and cheaper, as Netflix did in the beginning, but thinking about a radically different business model. Hence, a different innovation team working on can we test and eventually scale a streaming service. And I argue we don't necessarily have a lot of political support, let alone capabilities in humanitarian organizations for that second innovation dimension. But even more importantly, I would argue a third one, an innovation team that is even mandated with questioning some of the underlying paradigms that we operate in is pretty much non-existent. Working, for example, in international development predominantly, I still work under the paradigms of economics as they have been formulated about 100 years ago by white economists predominantly from the UK, which are, I would argue, not fit for the 21st century with existential crises by climate change and biodiversity. So exploring new macroeconomic paradigms in the development sphere would be work of an innovation team. Similarly, in humanitarian affairs, I think the recent murder of George Floyd in the US and conversations about race provided us also with an opportunity to increasingly reflect on power, on paradigms in the humanitarian system. And I just want to mention two concrete examples where this is really important and has been for a number of years. If we look at one of the most urgent humanitarian crises right now, it's unfolding in a EU member state. We've seen human rights abuses and we've seen real human suffering. And this is not in a developing country where the humanitarian system can, in parts, dictate the rules of the game, can test out new technologies. That's in the EU member state with much more state authority to rein in humanitarian aid with very different rules of the game. And that necessitates not only a theoretical reflection of power, it very much makes it necessary for us to think about underlying paradigms. Secondly, although conversations about this have been happening, we have seen progress since the World Humanitarian Summit, including through the localization agenda. I would argue that we still, when we look at local partners, want to see a mirror image of the established institution. What's your email address? What's your business model? What's your operating model? Still neglecting a lot of the community aid that's been developed that makes the most part of effective humanitarian support that we have through religious institutions and community aid. So I'm going to stop here as I'm at my 3-minute mark, just reflecting on those 3 potential functions for innovation and how can we do a better job, not only in enhancing what we do through emerging technologies, but also thinking about larger business models, but also about paradigms. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. I completely agree, and I look forward to maybe discussing in this panel a little bit more how we can shift that paradigm and power and innovate that. Next, we have from ELRHA, we have the Director of Programs, Kate Hart. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dianne. So thank you very much for this opportunity, first of all, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion we are having and will be having. Maybe for those of you that are less cited on ELRHA's work, a little bit of an overview of what we do. So we were established in 2009, and we believe that it is vital for both research and innovation to be a central part of humanitarian response to improve its effectiveness. So in this next 3 minutes, I will focus in on the humanitarian system and how, as ELRHA, we're trying to kind of address some of the challenges that we identified. So regarding the challenges of innovation in the humanitarian system, we believe, or we identified firstly, that innovations tend not to be sufficiently focused on the most pressing humanitarian needs. We also identified that there's insufficient evidence of what works and that there are too few solutions developed in response to those priority problems. Also, that humanitarians, funders, and policymakers tend not to have access to the information on what works, and indeed sometimes the opportunity to actually adopt it. And I'm sure we'll probably discuss this more in the panel. And then finally, as Ben has already alluded to, the lack of national voice and investment in what I will call the global south is a massive challenge. So at ELRHA, we try to organise all of our work to address the challenges that we've identified and to harness some of the opportunities. And we have what we call our 4 Ds. So the first D, and this is how we go about our business, the first D is we try and define the problems so that we are looking on the innovation side as well as research, but on innovation around evidence-based gaps. So for example, we're about to embark on a global prioritisation exercise, the GBE, to identify what the priorities are around those gaps around innovation as well as research. Engaging with global stakeholders, regional, national, also with people affected by crises themselves. And what we're also planning on doing is following the funding to really get an up-to-date sense of how much innovation and research are invested in around the world. Our second D, which is arguably what we're probably best known for, is our call for proposals. We've got different areas of focus on the innovation side with our Humanitarian Innovation Fund, which, as Ben says, is funded by FCDO and also other donors. We've got our gender-based violence program or area of work. We've got our WHF area of work. We've got our community-led innovation area of work. We have a strategic partnership with the Asia Disaster Reduction and Response Network. We've also got our scaling area of work, which Andrew might talk to as well, and our disability and older age inclusion. All of those grantees, once they're successful, we support and mentor them as they develop their innovations. Our third D is distilling evidence of work. Evidence of what works. I said before that was a real challenge in terms of gaps around knowledge and evidence, and so things that bubble up out of the grantees that we fund and elsewhere as well, we try and distill that and share that across the communities, and a lot of that is put in our humanitarian innovation guide, which is posted and online. And our fourth D, the driving change, this is something that we are really trying to do more of, and we would really want to do this in collaboration with others, is taking the innovations that work to the right place, the right people at the right time to try and leverage and get uptake in both humanitarian policy and response, to get that innovation sort of front and center and a central part of the humanitarian system. A couple of final challenges that I really want to mention before we stop. I think we're all challenged by capturing the difference that we make, that the humanitarian system has been challenged over the years in terms of capturing the collective humanitarian outcomes. And I think as across the communities that are working on humanitarian innovation, I think we're having the same challenges. So I think if we work together on this, I think that could be very, very exciting, a bit of a ground changer. And also we are concerned around ensuring that we take ethical, responsible innovation. So that's something that ELRHA's working on now. We've developed, or in the process of developing, for example, an ethics toolkit with the HHE research group for the wider community as well. I'll stop there though, because I think I probably touched upon my 3 minutes is up, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Those were very insightful and actually touched on many of the challenges that we have in the innovation space. So thank you for bringing them up. We'll talk more about them later. Next, we'll turn to Constance Agyeman, Head of International Development at Nesta Challenges. Constance, we're happy to have you. Over to you.
Sorry, had issues with unmuting button, which didn't want to respond at that particular time, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the introduction. There's always an issue with that mute button. So yes, thank you for inviting me to come along and talk. So I'm from Nesta, UK Innovation Foundation that looks at solving societal issues through bold ideas and supporting innovators to deliver those. I work specifically within Nesta Challenges, which has over the last decade been delivering challenge prizes. So we've been effectively setting societal challenges and incentivizing innovators in financial and non-financial ways, more importantly, to develop those solutions. And a number of the ways in which I guess we see the challenges around innovation are that innovation can seem like the shiny and new things, and I think both Ben and Kate have touched upon this. It's the shiny new technologies, and how do you get those, bright spark innovators to come up and deal with those. The issues around humanitarian aid and development are so complex that you can't take a single-sided approach to that, and so there are a number of different ways in which those situations have to be addressed. A number of programs are very limited in the type of financial instruments that they make available for these solutions to go into communities, and are very singular in their approach. So they might be grant systems, or they might be some form of investment that is very finite and only leads the solutions a certain way. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to think about more creative investment models and funding models that tie in a range of different types of partnerships that can guide and support innovators along the different elements of the pathway that they're going to need to approach. So that might be startup phase, but actually usually they're falling down the kind of valley of death in the middle because there isn't enough funding to support in that way. And then the future investment and different sustainability. I think there's a real importance in looking at innovation beyond the thing and thinking about it very much about the different business models, the different partnerships, the different ways in which you can engage with communities. And these things are often kind of left to the side or are kind of incidental. But actually, I think to really achieve the goals and head towards more sustainable achievements, we need to bring and harness those kind of blended models together. So looking at who are the key stakeholders in here and really working with communities that have lived experience, because I think we're often kind of just going away and kind of coming up with these wonderful ideas and not actually talking to people that are living the experience and not actually co-owning and co-designing with people that are living the experience that can give us a real insight and knowledge and ideas to sort out some of the issues that we're dealing with, and therefore have a real ownership of sustaining that long term. I think the other thing is, in terms of scaling, we can't really scale unless we bring some of these elements together, because we're then looking at them in silos, and that's where the breakdowns come. You can only take certain elements of these silos, whether it's a technology or whether it's a partnership or whether it's kind of community engagement so far, without kind of really tackling and grappling with some of the tough issues around partnership, co-ownership and co-design, and not having just singular entities really trying to achieve things by themselves. But I think, as we've already started to hear, you know, the partnerships that are coming together to have these conversations and deal with these issues are the ones that are going to be able to take some huge steps forward. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Constance. Really critical topic there on scalability and sustainability, bring it into the conversation of innovation. We need to work on that, and so I appreciate that. We'll talk about that later as well, hopefully. Next, let's turn to Therese Marie Uppstrom Pankratov, and she is the head of Humanitarian Innovation Program with Innovation Norway. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you, Dianne. I thought I would use my 5 minutes to talk about and to use one of the programs that we fund as an example of elements that we think are essential to humanitarian innovation. And by doing so, I will echo and support some of what has already been said here, which I'm very happy about. So one of the organizations that applied to us was the Norwegian People's Aid. They're a lead demining organization, and they applied to find a solution to locate and neutralize improvised explosive devices. They had identified a need and wanted to seek the help of private sector expertise to develop a solution. And that's the first point that I would like to make, is that the innovation process needs to be based on a need. The need must come first. And the NPA received funding from us, and they started their project by conducting a thorough needs assessment. And during that process, they found that what is needed is a tool to find not necessarily the explosive device itself, but the crunch wire, the extremely thin metal wire that will set off the explosive device if you step on it. And that when hidden can be near impossible to see. So the NPA is the expert on the need, and they explored every angle of it. They then proceeded to explore the private sector potential and to invite broadly to a market dialogue. Thus, they didn't jump to what they thought would be the solution. They remained open and explorative as to what might be possible. And this point that I would like to make that has already been made here today is that of partnership. So the humanitarian sector is so stretched, the organizations cannot be experts on everything. And by designing innovation processes around partnerships, consortia of humanitarian organizations, affected people, governments, academia, and private sector expertise, we're more likely to land on state-of-the-art solutions that can be taken up by the sector. These partnerships can be hard to forge, but the outcome is more likely to hit the mark, that is, meet the need and be sustainable. So the humanitarian organizations are often very concerned about reaching out to the private sector before a procurement process because they're concerned about safeguarding against corruption, and rightly so. However, there are frameworks developed to ensure that a procurement process is well informed at the same time as it safeguards against corruption. It's called innovation-friendly procurement or innovative procurement, and we have some guidance on it on the Innovation Norway website. So the NPA invited broadly the private sector to a market dialogue, and during this dialogue they presented the findings of their needs assessment and the performance they were looking for of the innovation. They did not describe any device that they wanted to have developed, but left it to the private sector to apply their technological know-how to the problem that they had identified. And so that's the third point that I would like to emphasize, is focus on performance and let the tech experts propose the inputs that will lead to the needed outputs. So during the market dialogue, one of the participating private sector partners asked, to find the crunch wire, what about light? Light is being used today by the police to examine crime scenes and can, amongst other things, find the thin strands of hair. Have you considered using light? Now, the NPA had not. This was a new idea to them, and because they had not already limited the search for solutions they were looking for, the room for innovation was still wide open to take new and exciting directions that might lead to better solutions being developed. So after a competitive procurement process, they have now entered into an innovation partnership with 2 different companies, exploring 2 different solutions, one of them being light. So needs-based, partnership-based, and performance-based. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Let's hand it over to, next we have Mr. Andrew Lamb. He's the innovation lead for Global Field Ready. Andrew, over to you.
Hi there, thank you for having me along today. I'm an engineer, I'm a systems engineer. And I've worked in disaster relief and development with Field Ready for about 5 years, and before that with Redar and Engineers Without Borders. And it's been quite interesting over the 15 years since I graduated to see how humanitarian innovation has evolved as a concept, as an idea, and actually now how it's sort of going global and going local. So I'm quite reassured by that. Field Ready is made up of about 80 people around the world, mainly field-based, who work with local people and often train local people to become innovators themselves, with a particular focus on manufacturing, locally manufacturing innovative items that can help with humanitarian relief, such as spare parts for medical devices, like you might find in a clinic to connect oxygen supplies, or spare parts for water systems. We work with other aid agencies to develop innovations. This is a bar of soap with a toy inside it to increase the rate of hand washing, very important during the COVID outbreak, but also working with local factories who develop much larger items for mass production. This is a standard Oxfam jerry bucket, and we're working with factories in Fiji and in Bangladesh to manufacture these locally because they can't get them to their countries for the humanitarian responses otherwise, even though it's a standard aid item. I'm here because Field Ready is essentially a 5-year-old startup, and we're scaling at the moment, and we're scaling with the support of a number of the humanitarian innovation funds, and we've had we've been lucky to be able to get the support of a number of humanitarian innovation funds, including from a number of the people here today, to be able to support that startup and to support that scale up. I think one of the things that's important for us is the localization agenda, and I'm hoping to emphasize that in my comments here about the scaling process for us. The World Humanitarian Summit, which we took part of, and I was really excited. As a startup organization, it was an amazing moment that went to hear on the main stage at the end of the World Humanitarian Summit, when they were talking about the localization agenda, the keynote speakers mentioning our innovation, because actually I would call it our innovation, but it's really about local manufacturing. So it's not necessarily done by us. And therein lies some of the problem, some of the challenge, that one of the big challenges that we have in terms of scaling the impact of our innovation is trying to help other aid agencies, other aid actors, local organizations, local businesses to adopt the innovation. And that can take time. It requires building skills, it requires opening up access to new technologies and so on. But there is a barrier, I think, to aid agencies doing a lot of this themselves. And that barrier is often being able to, it's about being able to change their system almost. Like, honestly, the supply chain and logistics systems of larger NGOs, which have enormous reach and enormous impact around the world, are very strongly defined. So trying to innovate within those can take a really long time, which as a startup can, not only be infuriating, but it can also cause problems with your bottom line, because, time is money. The other thing that is a challenge, I think it's a challenge from my perspective, if I was a new startup innovator coming into this space, is that innovation funds themselves, or humanitarian innovation funds themselves, are becoming much more specific about what they're looking for. So unless you can find a call that meets your particular niche, and I know they're trying to shape the market to address those niches where they have evidence that there are problems, but unless you can find a call that meets that particular niche, it's going to get really hard to get started. And I'm worried that might limit the participation of local organizations but the opportunities in innovation and humanitarian innovation around scaling for me are that a lot of the innovation funds that are available to startups now, to startup humanitarian innovators, are much bigger now. There's more money becoming available. And so the investments that we can find to really start and test and scale innovation, you know, are much better now than perhaps even 3-5 years ago. So that's a huge improvement, and I really commend the international donor community for really, you know, investing in that, in the scale up and putting more money into innovation funds, like the people with us today, to be able to kind of, you know, really kind of scale up the impact of the innovations simply by making the funds available bigger. There is a very strong focus on localization now, and I think that's a huge opportunity for really, you know, bottom-up grassroots. I'm nervous about using phrases like that because, you know, I would actually see that as field first rather than bottom up. You know, I think it's you try and innovate in the place where you want to have the most impact. But COVID-19 has presented, as much as it has a logistical challenge, an operational challenge to a lot of startups, it's presented a huge opportunity for localization. Necessity is the mother of invention, and necessity is the mother of innovation. And for local manufacturing, you know, we've been making the case since even before we started. The founders of our organization were talking about this, that, you know, for the purposes of, you know, economic development and job creation and poverty reduction in the places that we work, we should be procuring aid supplies locally. Or, you know what, if you buy locally, if you manufacture locally, it is often cheaper, better, faster to get the spare parts that you need by, you know, procuring locally. And, you know, there's all sorts of environmental and carbon benefits to doing things locally instead of having big international supply chains. And then you've got the localization agenda, and then you have this big agenda around this big recognition of political populism around the world, that actually people want to make stuff in their own countries and to develop themselves instead of outsourcing everything overseas. And the same goes for aid supplies and aid items. The problem is a lot of that wasn't really done. COVID-19 came along and everyone said, all the big aid agents, everyone realized we need to do more locally because the supply chains are broken. So, you know, now's the time to do it, and I'm really glad to see it scaling.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think you've touched on some really critical things here that we could spend hours talking about. How do we, you know, increase the connectivity? It's almost like we have two different connectors between the developing innovation, the valley of death, and then the big scale and sustainability that we need to plug into these organizations that can disseminate it on the ground and really make a difference in the impact in the humanitarian space for people that are in need. We're going to finish our introductions. I can't believe we're not even through these yet. So thank you for being patient. We have so many amazing speakers today. Safia Verjee is the Innovation Manager at Kenya Red Cross Society. Safia, over to you. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us here. We're really happy to be able to join and to share our experiences from Kenya. So as Dianne mentioned, my name is Safia. I work for the Kenya Red Cross as the Innovations Manager. And just to give a brief background for those that may not be familiar with the Kenya Red Cross, we are we're part of the Red Cross movement. We work as auxiliary to the government, and we have a sort of a grassroots presence. So we have 47 county branches, and we work directly with the communities. So I think I'd like to start by saying, like, why did we decide to set up an entire unit dedicated to innovation? And I think that comes from the fact that we really look for opportunities, technologies, new approaches on how can we improve our service delivery? How can we become more effective and efficient? And how can we prove value for money to our donors and also to our customers and beneficiaries. And also, how do we make sure that our end users are part of the entire solution? So this comes from like reducing the amount of ideas and products that we use from the West or from overseas, and start looking at capacities and skills that exist at home, and how can we use that to solve our own problems. So just to give a brief about some of the projects that we're currently implementing, I think our biggest project to date is setting up a fabrication innovation lab in a coastal city in Kenya called Lamu. This community is very, what I would say, skilled. They have local capacities and traditions in terms of making things by hand, and also just unfortunately are somehow very marginalized. So we have set up a fabrication lab in Lamu, and it's actually just going to be operational in about 2 weeks. But the idea is, how can we bring a community in a creative space, engage them in a very productive way, and teach them new skills, open their minds to what can be, and link them, take their skills from the past and link that to the modern world, so that their skills now become competitive at a global scale. So more on that maybe later, but it is a very exciting project that I'd love to share more on. But then as an innovation unit, we're also looking at how can we use technologies to improve our preparedness and response to disasters. So we have set up an in-house team to use drones and satellite imagery to provide information to help with decision making, and also from a preparedness perspective as well as from a response perspective. So providing almost real-time data and information to local stakeholders, to response agencies, to be able for us to make proper decisions, informed decisions. We also have a few projects that focus on using IoT solutions, looking at how we can use sensors, biometrics, to improve preparedness and disaster risk reduction efforts. And then we have also a couple of projects that we're using that uses blockchain technology. So our main use case for that is using it for cash transfers. So in the event of a disaster, we use blockchain technology to facilitate cash transfer to affected communities. And this essentially makes us more secure as an implementing agency, because all transactions are recorded, and it makes us more accountable and transparent to our partners, our donors, and our communities. But we also, on that note, take data protection and privacy very seriously. So we also have a policy in-house on what kind of information we collect and our sharing restrictions. So maybe then quickly on some of the challenges that we face as a new innovation unit, is this whole concept of failing fast and failing often to be able to succeed quicker. This whole concept of failing is somehow novel to a lot of aid agencies, with this whole aspect of why fix what isn't broken. So that's something I think that we've come face to face with quite often. And also this whole aspect of do no harm, because we are an emergency organization. Is innovating in an emergency the right thing to do? Or is it just going with what you know works? So those are some of the challenges that we are facing. I'd love to get more into it maybe in the discussion, but yeah, thank you for having us and allowing us to share our experiences.
Thank you, Safia. Thank you so much. Thank you. We look forward to hearing more about your work. Omar Al-Khadi is our last participant, not our last, but our last one listed. We're very excited to have him. He's the Regional Operations Manager at International Rescue Committee Hub. Omar, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me on the call. I'm really thrilled to be participating in this panel discussion. So I am Omar. I'm working with the International Rescue Committee with the Herbal Research and Innovation Impact Lab. covering the Middle East region. So maybe before speaking about my role, I want to explain a little bit about what we do in herbal research and innovation. And we basically design, test, and scale life-changing solutions for people affected by conflict and disaster. So our work is evolving around prototyping and piloting idea. And after many iterations, we conduct rigorous evaluation to measure our impact and cost effectiveness while keeping the scale at the center of our mindset. So today I'm going to cover maybe an interesting aspect of innovation, and it's focusing on the enabling environment of the humanitarian and non-profit sector for innovation and programming. And I'm going to address this from an operational and managerial point of view. So my role, as you introduced me, I'm the Regional Operations Manager for the Impact Lab in the Middle East. And my role basically work around mediating the relationship between innovation and programming and the bureaucratic NGO structure. And because innovation is very different in nature from typical programming in the non-profit sector, there is a significant need for this role to translate innovation language into bureaucratic support function such as supply chain, HR, and finance. So we are trying to work day and night with our colleagues from the operational department to create new SOPs and work approaches in order to streamline innovation and create a suitable enabling environment for innovation project to be successfully implemented within the humanitarian sector. I'm going also to speak about some of the challenges and opportunities that we foresee in today's crisis. So one of the emerging challenges that we see today is the new kind of emergencies that we are facing, which is affecting the entire world as whole. So, for example, the emergence of COVID-19 made a huge impact on all the countries in the world, which make us unable to respond effectively to the crisis. And this is maybe also due to the circumstances of such crisis, which limited our ability to be mobilized and to work with the affected community. So today we are unable to continue our daily normal programming, in addition to our inability to respond effectively to the crisis, because we cannot travel to the field as we used to do. We cannot meet with the people and listen to their challenges and co-design solutions with them. However, this emerging crisis also brings us a very valuable opportunity that I think we need to exploit together today. So, as you know, the world has been transforming into a digital world, whereby many people are being connected to the internet and they started using communication and other technologies that they never used before. So this, I see it as an opportunity that would allow us to reach out to people that we were not able to reach before at all due to some accessibility problems such as security and distance from these affected community. So today we have the opportunity to tackle into new areas and work hand in hand with communities to understand their problem and co-design innovative and effective solution for them. Therefore, we need to fully exploit this opportunity and transform our work approaches into digital approaches, whereby we can digitize all our community engagement and operational tools. However, bureaucracy again is the biggest enemy for this transformation, and we need to work with not only within our organization, but with donors and regulating entities to transform our business approaches. Another opportunity I see today, I want to echo field ready about the need for localization. So we've been speaking about localization for a very long time, but due to the impact of the existing crisis, today everybody understands the need for localization. And therefore, this is a huge opportunity for us to embark on this opportunity and build the capacity of the local community to produce their needs locally. And one of the projects that we are starting to create now in Syria is to create a decentralized supply chain solution for medical supplies to encounter COVID-19 by the health sector inside Syria. But however, in order to make localization successful, we also need to alter our business approaches to support these local capacities. So again, working with supply chain on changing their business model and make them not think only about business metrics such as cost and the quality while considering procurement, but also thinking about what impact they are making on the community that we are trying to serve who are impacted by the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. I'd like to open this up now and have a discussion. We have about 20 minutes to chat and really do a little bit of a deep dive, if we can, on some of these subjects. We touched for a little bit on how innovation is not always focused on the most pressing solutions that are needed in the humanitarian sector on the ground. And yet there's more money now and financing. We have enough money to solve these problems. And it's, you know, how can we do better in this space of innovation? How do we focus more on what's really critical and what's really important? How do we innovate a focus and as a first step? I'd like to just open that up to the panel for anyone to contribute in this space to this question. Ben, I'm going to call on you first.
Thanks. And instead providing a straightforward answer, I want to challenge our notion on the most urgent needs to a little bit of to a certain degree. Obviously, they're clear human needs and we have to address them. But I would argue, what is like the time horizon we are thinking of? Having been part of the journey of developing the regional refugee and resilience plan in response to the Syria crisis and seeing humanitarian and development response merge in, I think that's a pretty good example of thinking slightly differently about addressing needs on a time horizon. But even more importantly, I'm highly inspired by like recent regulatory innovations, providing part of the Ganges River or the Wanganui River in New Zealand with the same rights as living human entities. So infusing intergenerational justice and thinking in development, but also humanitarian work, I think is the right aspect. And that would reframe the question, whose needs? And I would argue we have to think about the needs of yet unborn generations. And to go back to the Ganges example, not only human entities. So I don't want to take away at all a focus on clear human needs, people who are starving, people who are affected by disasters. Please don't get me wrong, but I want to expand our horizon, particularly on the humanitarian development nexus. Secondly, having worked in New York for quite a while and having been part of UN Week and many panels on innovation with private sector partners, I have encountered, Andrew, an approach that is not quite what you outlined, which is let's innovate kind of where the crisis is. I'm not innovating right now in Germany. I've worked in the field, meaning in German cities for 10 years, but now I focus on international questions. And I've encountered a lot of very smart, motivated people who want to innovate around humanitarian needs in countries they've never been to, or they might have visited once or twice. And so I just want to introduce the notion of, I think a lot of our innovation thinking focuses on shared value, on private sector engagement. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but again, offering a complementary perspective and thinking about innovation, not always resulting in a win-win scenario. If innovation means changing the status quo, some people will lose privilege, some people will lose that they're benefiting currently from the status quo, and that's fine. How can we innovate around that? I have not come across one person who said, how can we innovate around the production of small arms? Directly linked to humanitarian disaster, how can we put an end to this? You know, because that's not a win-win situation straightforwardly. So when I think about needs, I want to offer these two complementary perspectives. Whose needs? Only humans? Only our generation? And secondly, when we're talking about needs, clearly they're humanitarian needs by humans. But there's the other side of the coin where meaningful innovation and driving change is not always linked to a win-win scenario that's clearly identified through a need, but pushing tough political change through, that's not always easy, and that requires struggle, and there's plenty of room to innovate.
Thank you, Ben. And Kate?
Can I maybe add one additional comment on the time frame, sort of to add to what Ben has just said? I think there's a real challenge there, a real tension between. I mean, people out there are saying it's a 10 to 15 year plus horizon that you, or longer, Ben, that you want to look at. But the funding that is available, whether it's for in-country, national, the global funding, is for a much shorter time frame. So I know even our and Andrew might want to talk more about this, but even the grantees that we funded for our taking things to scale grantees, that was a sort of a 2 to 3 year funding period. Our grantees were saying thank you. There are very few funding available to enable the taking to scale, but it's still for 2 to 3 years, and it's limited what's out there when we really need to be looking at a much greater time frame if we're wanting to do what Ben has said. So there is a significant tension there. And then I think on top of that, what we've been talking about earlier in terms of, and I hate the word localization myself, because that implies that something is being localized from somewhere else. But anyway, I think if you're then wanting to, you're wanting to really hear the views and the challenges and the issues of the people that are being affected by these crises around the world, then that's even more challenging, with the funding that's available. So Ben, I agree with you. I think there is a real tension there in terms of what is out there currently.
So how do we transcend this valley of death? Really, that's really what we're talking about. I believe that most of the innovations can be created by those that are suffering. My experience has been that when we go to the communities and we ask them what they need, that they generally they know the solutions and innovations that are needed better than we do. But the issue is they don't have the resources, and they often don't have the connections, the mentorship, the proper growth ability. So how do we transcend that valley of death and help them identify and connect better with all of us?
If I may, give a reflection on that question from my experience. Before we started the ELRHA Humanitarian Innovation Fund scheme to scale up, the Accelerating the Journey to Scale funding scheme, the scaling program that they run, the main way that we were sort of trying to climb out of that valley of death, as it were, was by working with the kind of labs that Safia is setting up in Lamu, that Omar at the IRC is setting up, that they would become the kind of places that the local engineers that we would hire would be able to work, and that we'd be able to make connections from those labs into the aid agencies themselves, but also into the local community. So I think that those having these sorts of hubs or focus points, and there's been the Response Innovation Lab we're still part of. There's been a number of sort of lab initiatives over the years have really helped Field Ready through that valley of death. I think the other thing is that it's almost like you need some erosion from the top of the valley. You need the walls of the valley to come down a little bit. Omar's point in his opening there, where he was talking about how innovation projects are, very different in form or need to be managed in a very different way. Yet, many of the innovation contracts that we get are essentially the same version of contract, the same contract that a big organization might use to procure a decorator or a cleaning service or something like that, where there's a very, very rigid timeline and outputs and deliverables and things like that. So the ability to fail fast isn't there. To fail fast and then pivot isn't there. So overcoming some of those bureaucratic barriers and sort of being able to kind of climb out of that valley of death and really flourish is about sort of eroding the heights to which we have to reach to be able to make progress, I think.
Thank you, Andrew. Constance, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I wanted to ask you something. You mentioned so often in innovation space, we look at the shiny new innovation. I think those were your words. And I would love to know a little bit more about the Great Innovation Challenge and maybe what challenges organizations have in bringing the innovations to scale that are really truly usable.
So it's always a really tricky thing because there are the restrictions on the type of funding mechanism and the length of that funding that's available. And so what we try to do with our challenges, from the very start is make them evidence-based and research-focused so that when we are targeting and asking those innovators to address a particular issue, we understand that we've worked with the community, we've talked with a different range of stakeholders to really nail that down effectively. So we know that there's a need and a drive to really work in those particular areas. I think then with the approaches that we take, for instance, with our data-driven farming prize that was kind of really focused on smallholder farmers, or looking at pest management of fall armyworm in sub-Saharan Africa, it's really about making the right connections in those spaces so that it's not just dependent on the funding mechanism that we have to keep the sustainability potential of those programs going. It's knowing that we've built the right type of capacity among the innovators. We've made sure there's a real connection with what is happening in field. We have spoken to potentially private sector investors as well as other funders and governments that might be the ones that are taking those services and keeping them going long term. There are just so many facets and layers and attributes to these programs that we need to think about a lot more carefully before we kind of establish them in order to be able to kind of help manifest something that's much more sustainable, that's co-owned, that has some real potential and doesn't just fall off the scale when one type of funding stream stops. Either it's stronger in a business capacity and can continue to develop in that way, or it's identified that actually it's not a commercial enterprise and it's actually the governments that we need to work with to really start to embed this within public implementation and policy. And those variables, can be the difference between life and death of these ideas and the way in which they can scale. And that's what I think sometimes we don't think enough about before the program. And part of what we're trying to do with our challenge prizes is ensure that we're designing in a way that kind of looks at the long term beyond what we can offer, because we know that's limited.
Thank you so much. You're absolutely right on. Safia, just a quick thought from you on what ways we should, as humanitarian organizations, explore different avenues for funding.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we need to be innovative about even our financing and how we go about looking for funding to support our interventions. I think that leads me to what Therese had talked about in terms of partnerships. Partnerships that add value, consortiums that include organizations that have like-minded missions and visions, so that we're not replicating efforts. So even to donors, even to funding agencies, you're a lot more attractive when we come together as organizations in a country to solve a common problem. And then one thing also that we are working towards is making sure that all the solutions that we pilot have that component of interoperability. So other organizations can also start using solutions. We're not spending a lot of financing developing the same sort of solutions. As the Kenya Red Cross, I'm not sure maybe if you're aware, but we've also sort of branched out into having income generating activities that are sort of profit driven, but the funding then comes back to to the national society, to our disaster pool. So that's in an effort to make us self-sustainable and not dependent or reliant on foreign aid. So, for example, we've set up an ambulance company that looks at, it's got a profit business model, but all those profits then come back to us to be able to fund our own efforts, and that we're not relying on government or foreign donors. So I think we have to think outside the box in terms of how we raise funds and the different funding avenues that are there. But also looking for sort of low-cost solutions. We don't need a lot of money to sort of develop a solution and pilot it to get a proof of concept. I think sometimes we look for the millions when the thousands will kind of give us what we need, and then then the funding for scale up then is a lot more available at that point. So yeah, I think those are my comments on that.
Thank you so much. I love the whole concept of seed funding. I did that a lot early stages, and really believe investing in youth and helping them, mentor with them along with the seed funding, really extending our lives basically. I'm a grandmother of 4, mother of 4. I'm at that end where I want to partner with youth because I want to create a better world for my grandchildren. I'm in for the long game. I'm not in it for, the shiny new toy like Constance mentioned. So I want you each we only have like 3 minutes left. I so appreciate each one of you that have been here and your incredible expertise. I've worked with some of you before in UN Innovation Network, Ben, and different areas. And so I know the depth of your knowledge, and I just can't express it enough that it's so important for you to share what you know so that those innovators and those people that are living the problems can help be a part of the solution, including youth, including those people who don't have the resources and they have no way of connecting with the right people to connect with the organizations that can make their knowledge into reality and tools. So I know you all have something in your heart that has touched you. We only have like 30 seconds each, but if we could just go around and just leave us with one last message before we leave this critical subject. And maybe we could just go in the line that we just introduced ourselves in. So Ben, I'll start with you, then Kate, Constance, Therese, Andrew, Safia, Omar. Amazing contributions. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, and really enjoyed this panel. To kind of stay in line with what I said was much more on the conceptual level, I'll finish with language matters. Let's think more about solidarity than aid. Let's think about people with agency, not beneficiaries. And with that, I'm going to hand over to the next speaker. Thanks.
Kate?
I would like to second that, multiply that by a factor of, infinity and beyond. And then for me, just hearing our conversations now and hearing the chat, the more we can work collaboratively, collegiately, collectively on these things through formal and informal partnerships and networking, the better, because we really need that collective collegiate action, and we're all in different communities, and my goodness, if we manage to harness that, that would be a very, very wonderful thing for people affected by crises. So yeah, let's not stay in our silos. Let's try and do that collective action.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Ben. Constance?
I think just kind of mirroring on from Kate, that collaboration is key. And I think we have to find ways of innovating to have really deep and meaningful collaboration. And so we shouldn't look at that as a separate thing. To collaborate to innovate, we should innovate to collaborate as well.
Thank you, Constance. Therese, we didn't hear much from you, but we'd like to hear from you now.
Thank you, Dianne. I'd like to pick up on something that you said at the very beginning when you said that we have to innovate around trust. And with respect to partnerships, I think that is so essential. And the program that I had is set up to de-risk humanitarian private innovation partnerships. And we find that trust is such an issue in establishing those partnerships. So we'd just like to echo that we need to innovate also around the things around the shiny innovation, and trust being one of them.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Therese. Andrew.
Thank you for this. I'm on the point about language. One of the things that I am going to be reflecting on is, what Kate's point was about the impression that we have when we use the word localization, the idea that something's coming from outside and being localized. I tend to think that localization, not many people agree with me, by the way. I tend to think of localization as being sort of complement to globalization. The World Humanitarian Forum taking place today is part of the UN General Assembly that is celebrating essentially 75 years of the success of globalization. But now we're dealing with the problems that globalization has caused. And so localization, in my view, the sort of complement to globalization is what the world
Thank you so much. Sorry, we're out of time. I want to get to Safia and then Omar. Last thoughts?
Okay, just quickly for me, just making sure end users, communities, the human-centered approach is key to designing all innovative solutions. I can't emphasize that enough.
Thank you so much. Omar, final thoughts?
I want to add on this point and to keep the community that we are trying to serve at the center of innovation and to build their capacity to take the lead, because even if a certain innovation project will not take off, we will leave a change maker in the community that would innovate for other challenges and find other solutions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you joining the World Humanitarian Forum. Let's not leave anyone behind. Let's actually make them part of building and innovating solutions for the next generation. So once again, thank you for joining us today, talking about innovation in all its forms at the World Humanitarian Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.